Hi there, my name is Jonathan Tuliani. I'm the Managing Director in Europe for Opsgility. I've been working with Azure for many years. I actually spent nearly 10 years in Microsoft, most of those in the Azure product group, where I was a program manager with the Azure networking team, working on the Azure DNS service and the Azure Traffic Manager service. I'm one of the authors of the Microsoft Azure Administrator exam reference, the AZ-103 exam, and I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. So in this talk, we're going to be looking at Azure Lighthouse, which is a relatively new service in Azure designed for multi-tenant Azure management at scale. We're going to start with a brief recap of how access control in Azure works, because that's a fundamental background to understanding how Azure Lighthouse works. We'll then describe what Azure Lighthouse is, and we'll talk through how to get started. There's a couple of different ways of using Azure Lighthouse, and we'll run through both. We'll look very closely at the permissions that you need to use Azure Lighthouse, because that's an important subject to understand. And then we'll look at how, having got Azure Lighthouse set up and working, how you can use it to manage resources in a delegated subscription. Okay, let's get started. First, with an overview of how access control works in Azure. In Azure, identity is managed by Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory is really separate from your Azure subscriptions. Your subscriptions are linked to your directory, and your directory contains your users. And those users take different forms. They can be individual users, but also groups of users, and service principals and managed identities, which are like users that are used by code rather than people. If maybe you have some automation that has access to your Azure subscriptions for some purpose or other, such as turning off VMs on the weekend. So your subscriptions are linked to your Active Directory tenant. Now, sometimes we talk about an Active Directory tenant, or we talk about your Active Directory directory. That's really the same thing. It's your account in the Azure Active Directory service that represents your organization. Typically, an organization has a single Active Directory tenant, although large organizations sometimes have more than one tenant. For example, if they have been through an acquisition and acquired another company. There is a facility in Azure Active Directory known as Azure AD B2B collaboration that allows you to invite other users into your directory as a guest. So this guest user can log in with their existing credentials, but have access to your directory. And up until Azure Lighthouse was released, this was really the way that a Microsoft partner, maybe a managed service provider, could manage resources in a customer subscription. But there are a number of limitations with that approach, which we'll discuss later, and Azure Lighthouse provides a much better approach to cross-tenant resource management. It's important to understand the role of Azure Resource Manager and how role-based access control works. Whenever you are managing Azure resources, those requests come into Azure Resource Manager, and they can come from multiple different sources. You see on the slide, maybe they're coming from Visual Studio or the Azure Portal or PowerShell or the CLI or the Azure SDKs. Whichever tool you're using, everything comes in through Azure Resource Manager. And in Azure Resource Manager, role-based access control is enforced, along with other mechanisms such as resource locks and policy and so on. So role-based access control verifies the identity of the person making the request, and that is done using the authentication that comes from Azure AD. Azure AD owns the identity and handles the authentication. And then within Azure Resource Manager, you have the role definitions and role assignments that enable Azure Resource Manager to determine what the authorization is, what this particular person who's making this call is allowed to do. So Azure AD gives the identity. It confirms that if I'm making a request, yes, it's really me. It's Jonathan making the request. And then the authorization in the role-based access control says, yes, he is allowed to delete this VM, or he is allowed to create a storage account, whatever task I've requested. If the request is accepted, it is then passed through to one of the underlying resource providers, and there are many resource providers available in Azure. Common examples are shown on the slide, such as the Microsoft Compute resource provider, Microsoft.Network resource provider, storage and web, and so on. An important detail of how the role-based access control works is that the tenant ID is not part of the resource ID of the resource you're trying to work on. On the slide, you see an example of a resource ID, and you can see that it includes the subscription ID, it includes the resource group name, it includes the resource type, and it includes the resource name. In this case, it's a storage account called MyStorage 9607. But you'll notice the tenant ID is not included. Only the subscription ID is included. And that's because the tenant ID is really inferred from the identity of the caller who's making the request, or inferred from the subscription ID. It's not listed explicitly. And that is actually key to how Azure Lighthouse works. This idea that the tenant ID isn't explicitly in the request. It enables Azure Lighthouse to work across tenants in a way that we'll see very shortly. Okay, now we've understood a little bit about how Azure Resource Management works. Let's have a look at Azure Lighthouse. Let's start, first of all, by thinking about the challenges that Azure Lighthouse is designed to address. Suppose you're a managed service provider and you are managing multiple customer accounts. Maybe you have 50 accounts or 100. I've used an extreme example of 1,000 on the slide. But how do you manage Azure resources across so many different tenants, Azure AD tenants? So until Azure Lighthouse came along, Azure B2B collaboration was the main tool for this, to allow guest access into another tenant. And this is a big advantage in that it does allow you to log in with your existing credentials. You don't have to have 100 different usernames and 100 different passwords for each different tenant that you manage. But there are still a lot of limitations with B2B collaboration. In particular, it only allows individuals to be granted access. There's no group management, which in any reasonable size organization is going to make it impractical. And also the user has to switch into the context of the customer tenant. So if you're a partner managing multiple tenants, then you're forever switching from one tenant to another to another. You don't have any way of managing them together as part of a single view. You're switching from one tenant to another. If you have any automation, that is also facing the same kind of challenge. And you've no aggregated views. You've no way of seeing a rolled up view of all the virtual machines, for example, that you're managing, or seeing a security center view across multiple subscriptions, across multiple tenants. B2B collaboration doesn't support that. So it's avoiding that context switching, which is key to be able to manage the large numbers of different customer tenants at scale. And that's what Azure Lighthouse is designed to do. Azure Lighthouse is designed to enable partners such as managed service providers to manage multiple customers more easily. It works by projecting the customer resources into the MSP, the partner tenant, so that from within that tenant, staff within the Microsoft partner can manage multiple customers without having to context switch across the different tenants. Lighthouse can also be used by enterprises that have multiple AAD tenants. For example, if an enterprise has done an acquisition and it has more than one Azure AD tenant, you can use Azure Lighthouse to manage resources across those tenants, again, without having to do the context switch between AAD tenants. Lighthouse also provides a marketplace channel opportunity for partners. In particular, there is the ability for partners to make their MSP services available through the Azure Marketplace, and it enables them to be more discoverable and easily consumed by the customer through the marketplace. And also, it's one of the technologies that enables what we call managed applications, where an ISV, for example, can publish an application which will run in the customer's subscription. So the customer pays the consumption charges, but the partner is able to manage that application on the customer's behalf, for example, to manage patching and updates and so on. We're going to look primarily at the former scenario, the MSP scenario, where a partner is providing services to manage resources that are in the customer's subscription, in the customer's tenant. Another thing to note is that Azure Lighthouse is free of charge. There's no additional charge for using Lighthouse to manage the resources. It simply enables you to manage things in a new way, and Microsoft obviously makes their money from the resources themselves. So as we said, the key concept of Azure Lighthouse is this idea of delegated access. And this is where a subscription is projected into the MSP tenant. And you see the little picture there. You have the Azure subscription, and the subscription remains within the customer's tenant. The customer can still see their own subscription. But in addition, that same subscription becomes visible in the MSP's tenant. So now the same resources in the same subscription can be managed from both tenants, assuming that the user, of course, has the correct permissions in order to do so. And for the MSP, those permissions are set up as part of the delegation process, as part of how Lighthouse is enabled for that MSP. Those permissions are in place. This ability for a partner to manage resources efficiently and at scale for their customers enables a whole range of scenarios that the partner can offer. Some examples are given on the slide. For example, backup and site recovery, being able to make sure that backup is running correctly and site recovery is working correctly for the customer's resources. monitoring the customer's resources, making sure that alerts are managed, that you have the correct responses in place. For example, if disks are getting full and you're able to take action if there's anything that needs attention for proactive maintenance. The partner can, of course, use automation of their own to handle alerts that they have rather than managing alerts manually. And this can be opportunity for the partner to leverage their IP at scale across large numbers of customers. It may be that the partner is offering governance services for the customer to make sure that, for example, policy is correctly assigned and enforced in the customer subscriptions, which reduces the risk for the customer and can help the customer achieve any compliance requirements they have. And this even includes the ability to support automatic remediation on certain policies that support that feature. It may be that the partner is offering services that automate customer operations at scale. So they can use Azure Automation to access delegated resources in the customer subscriptions. And a nice feature of this is that Lighthouse, when a MSP is using their automation in this way, the customer doesn't see the Azure Automation runbooks. So it protects the partner's IP. The partner's IP has access to the customer subscriptions. It can perform these operations, but the IP, the scripts that the partner has invested in, those scripts remain confidential to the partner. It may be that the partner is helping with security management, for example, using Security Center to make sure that the customer is implementing best practices and making sure that the Security Center recommendations or Azure Advisor recommendations are being acted upon or at least reviewed. And also, just in general, any resources that the customer is running in their subscription, whether that's infrastructure or platform as a service applications, any resources that are managed through Resource Manager can be managed through Lighthouse. And that enables the partner to provide services managing these resources on behalf of the customer. For more details on these examples, please see the link on the slide. Now we've understood at a high level what Azure Lighthouse is and the scenarios that it's designed to address. Let's look at a little bit more detail at how you can get started with Azure Lighthouse. There are two ways that a customer can enroll with a partner to enable Azure Lighthouse. The first of these is through the marketplace, and the second is independently of the marketplace, simply by deploying a template. Let's have a look at both of these. So on the marketplace side, the partner will publish an offer to the Azure Marketplace showing the details of the service that they're offering on behalf of the customer with a description, and also describing the permissions that they need in order to provide this service to the customer. Do they need just read permissions, for example, or do they need write permissions on customer resources? The customer can browse these offers from various different partners in the marketplace. And once the customer has chosen an offer, they can simply accept that offer and deploy it into their subscription. This creates a relationship between the customer and the partner, and the customer can then go on to delegate specific subscriptions or just resource groups to the partner for the partner to manage. The second way, as we said, is for the customer to enroll using a template. In this case, you're not using the marketplace, so it doesn't require the partner to publish a marketplace offering. The customer simply deploys a template that contains certain details that the partner has provided. And this is the same details that go into the marketplace offer, in particular, the tenant ID of the partner, so the customer knows which partner it is that they're delegating access to, and also the permissions that the customer is willing to grant to that partner, such as read permissions or write permissions and so on. The template contains that information, and maybe the MSP may help, the partner may help in defining the contents of the template, and the customer simply deploys that template into their subscription, and that enables the delegation of their subscription or their resource groups to the partner. And from that point, the partner is free to manage the resources on behalf of the customer. Let's have a look at both of these options in a little more detail. For the Azure Marketplace, it starts with the partner, the MSP, publishing their offer in the marketplace. Now, to do this, the partner must be a Microsoft partner, and they must enroll in the commercial marketplace program. It's one of several programs available to partners of Microsoft. They will then create a managed services offer within the commercial marketplace, and this is done using a portal called cloudpartner.azure.com, although this is moving to Partner Center starting from the 30th of March 2020. So there's a change that's happening at the time of recording very shortly in that area. Within this offer, they then specify a plan which contains the details of the service that they are offering. And there's a few settings there that are important to understand. And we'll have a look at those in a demo very shortly. They include the billing model, which can either be a bring your own license model. In other words, the partner is paid by the customer out of band, not through the marketplace. Or it can be a percentage of the Azure consumption, where whatever consumption is being charged for the resources being managed, an additional percentage is paid to the partner through the marketplace and through the Azure bill. Offers in the marketplace can be public or private. A partner may start with a private offer that they use for testing and so on, or maybe they have a private relationship with some specific customers that they want to make their offer visible to, but not to the marketplace as a whole. When using a private offer, the MSP publishing the offer needs to list the subscription IDs of the customers that will be able to take advantage of that offer. So the partner and the customers must work together to make the offer private. So the subscription IDs are known to the partner at the time they publish the offer. The last thing that you have in the offer is the list of authorizations. So this is where the partner will say, these are the roles, these are the users, or more likely the groups of users that are going to have access to the customer's subscriptions. And these are the permissions they need. Maybe it's the contributor role, or maybe it's the reader role or such like. And we'll look in more detail at the authorizations that the partner may request a little bit later in this presentation. Once all those details are in place, the partner will publish that offer to the marketplace. Now, there's a review process for things to go into the marketplace, so that process can take several days. Let's have a little look at the UI for the Cloud Partner Marketplace. So here we are in the cloudpartner.azure.com portal, which is the current portal used for generating the marketplace offers. As we said, this will move to the normal Partner Center portal in due course. And here we see a particular offer that I've got here in the marketplace. You see, it's just a test offer with some test settings for the name and the summary and the description. And here you can see the two different billing models. You can have bring your own license or a percentage of consumption. If I change it to the percentage, then I have to enter a number between 0 and 100 for how much of the Azure's consumption will be charged in addition as a fee to the partner. So I'll leave this on the bring your own license model. And then we can choose, is this a private plan or not? So I can say, yes, it's a private plan, in which case I have to provide the customer subscription IDs for only these subscriptions will be able to take advantage of this particular offer. And I can do these either manually here, or I can upload a CSV file that will, if I have lots of subscription IDs, that obviously makes that much easier. Or I can say that, no, this is not a private plan, it's a public plan that will be available in the marketplace. And you can see here that that is a one-way trip. If you publish something to the marketplace, you can't then turn around and say, oh, no, actually, that's private after all. Once it's public, it stays public. So let me cancel from there. And the last part you then have is, as well as these settings, is you have those permissions that I mentioned. And here they come in the form of this manifest, which specifies, firstly, my tenant ID. This is the tenant that the customer's subscription is going to be projected into. And here you then specify the users and the permissions that those users are going to get. So these are users within the partner tenant, within the tenant ID above. And I'm saying this particular user or group, it's just an object ID from Azure AD from this tenant. So this particular user, and I give it a display name here where I say what it is. I might say this is my security team, or this is my 24/7 operations team. I give a description for who this is that you're granting permissions to, and I say which permissions you need. And this is just the standard Azure built-in roles that I can choose from here. So I provide the permissions and the role. And by accepting this marketplace offer, you're agreeing that these permissions will be granted, you as a customer, that is. And you can specify multiple permissions. You can only specify a single role here. So if you need multiple roles, then of course you just provide multiple entries. So here you can see I've got one assignment for the contributor role, and I've got another one for this resource policy contributor, because in this case, I want to be able to manage policy, and the contributor role doesn't have access to manage policies. So I provide an additional role assignment to do the policy management. Here as well, I've got a user access administrator. And in this case, there are some special restrictions, and we'll talk more about those when we come back to the slides. But you'll see here with user access administrator, I have to specify which additional roles will be assignable. The user access administrator won't be able to assign just any role. They'll only be able to assign the roles that I list here. And also they'll only be able to assign those roles to managed identities. They won't be able to assign them to other types of user. So they can't assign them to other actual user groups or individuals, for example. Okay, and the last one I have here, you see at the bottom of the screen, is this one, the Managed Services Registration Assignment Delete role. It's a bit of a mouthful. This enables me as the partner to remove this customer from my tenant if I would like to at a later date. So this is an important one to assign. And again, we'll talk about that when we talk about the permissions. So this is what it looks like to define your offering. There's a few other settings to fill in. For example, there's a contact details and little graphics of your icon to make the marketplace look pretty. But these are the interesting settings that describe your offer from a technical point of view. And when these are ready, you can go through the publish process, which first publishes to a preview and that you can validate, and then eventually publishes to the marketplace once the offer has been approved. Okay, we've seen how the marketplace approach to using Azure Lighthouse works from the partner's point of view for publishing the offer to the marketplace. Now let's see how it works from the customer's point of view. So for the customer browses to an area in the Azure portal called Service Providers. And from here, they can browse the marketplace and look at the various different service provider offers that are available. And for each of those offers, they can view the description that the partner has published, and they can review the permissions that the partner is requesting to see if these are permissions that they're happy to grant. You know, maybe that it's something that you might be very sensitive to, obviously. And once they've reviewed those, they have to accept the terms. And on the slide, you can see the terms that the terms effectively say that they give permission for the provider to have access to their resources, and that it's not Microsoft's responsibility, it's the provider's responsibility. So they review those terms, and once they've accepted them, they click create. This creates the relationship from the customer to the managed service provider. Having created that relationship, the next stage is for the customer to choose the actual subscriptions or resource groups that will be delegated to the provider. So here, again, from within the service provider's view, they will choose to delegate resources. And here they choose which of the existing relationships they have, the relationship they just set up from the marketplace, for example, and they can then choose, well, which subscriptions and which resource groups are going to be delegated. And again, they have to accept the terms, which are similar to the ones we just talked about, and they click delegate. And this will then create the delegation that enables the partner to have access to those resources. Let's have a look at the customer experience for using Lighthouse through the marketplace. Here I am in an Azure subscription, and there is a service available called Service Providers. I can find it simply by using the global search at the top of the screen. And in here, I start by clicking Service Provider Offers on the left, or you can see here Managed Service Providers Offers at the bottom. And if I click Add Offer, it will open up the marketplace showing me the various service provider offers. And you can see these various different offers available from different service providers here in the marketplace. There's a few test items there, and obviously a lot of different offers from different service providers. If we choose just one of these, I'll just pick one. You can then have a look at a description of the service that's being offered. And if I click on the second tab here, plans, you can see the details of this particular plan. If I click create, here you can see which subscription you're going to provide access to. This is, in my case, the Contoso subscription 2 within my Contoso directory. And you choose the region, which is just the region that represents the resources that represent the delegation. This region can be any region, and it will work the same regardless. And you provide a name and a description. And on the second tab here, if we see review and create, you can see the terms that the service provider gave when they created their marketplace offering. So here on the review and create, you can see as a customer, you can see what the access permissions are that you're going to be granted. So you can see that, yes, am I happy to grant these permissions before you actually grant them? You also need to provide some details for your as a customer so that the service provider can contact you, such as a phone number and email address. And when you're happy with all of this, you accept the conditions and you click create. And this will submit a deployment which creates the relationship between the customer and the service provider. And these deployments are fairly quick. You can see it's actually succeeded already. And if we go back to the service provider's view, and we now look at the service provider's offers, you can see that we have this relationship in place. Now, this hasn't actually granted its permissions to any specific subscriptions. You can see here it says no delegations. This has simply created a relationship with the partner, but no actual delegation of any particular subscription or resource group. So now we need to add a delegation. You can do that from this plus button over here, or we can go and view our delegations separately here, and we can delegate resources with this button. When we do the delegation, we choose which provider it is. It may be that you're working with multiple service providers. So, of course, you may be having to choose between various different service providers for who you delegate. And you can delegate the same subscription to more than one provider, so that two providers may be providing different services for you within an individual subscription. And then here you can choose to delegate a subscription. I can choose my Fabricam subscription, for example, or I can delegate a individual resource group or resource groups. I can choose specific resource groups that I want to delegate to this particular provider. So I choose my resource groups, and again, I accept conditions and I click delegate, and this will delegate that particular resource group to that provider using the permissions that were in the offer that the provider published. They don't get any permissions beyond the ones that they requested. Okay, we've seen from the Azure portal how you can use Azure Lighthouse using the marketplace, and we've seen how that works both from the partner's point of view publishing an offer, and we've seen how from the customer's point of view they can browse the offers, they can choose their offer, and accept the conditions, see the permissions that are being granted to the partner, and then they can choose to delegate individual subscriptions or resource groups to that partner. Now, it's useful to understand what is happening under the hood when you do that. What is actually happening at a resource level? What were the resources that were created in order to represent that Lighthouse delegation? And that's what's covered on this slide. These resources both sit in the Microsoft.Managed Services resource provider. And the first one is the registration definition, and the second one is the registration assignment. The registration definition represents the relationship with the service provider. That's the thing that you got from the marketplace. It contains the tenant ID of the service provider, and it contains those permissions that the service provider was requesting, and the name and the description of the offer and so on. So this is what you create when you take that offer from the marketplace and you deploy to your subscription. And the second one is the registration assignment. On its own, the registration definition doesn't enable the partner to actually do anything because they have no delegations, no actual assignments delegated to their control. The assignments are where you delegate a subscription or a resource group to the partner. So what the assignment does, it's a resource that sits at the scope that's being assigned. So if you want to delegate a subscription, you create the registration assignment at subscription scope. If you want to delegate a resource group, you create the registration assignment at the scope, at that resource group scope. So it sits within the scope that is being delegated. And the properties of the registration assignment are very simple. It's simply a link to the registration definition, nothing else. As we said, there are two ways to use Azure Lighthouse. The first was from the marketplace, which we've been looking at. And the second way is by directly deploying a template into the customer's subscription. And this is where it's useful to understand the resources that we just talked about, because the template is going to deploy the registration definition and the registration assignments explicitly into the customer's subscription rather than using the marketplace. That's all the template is doing, creating the same resources that we were creating through the portal, but just through a template instead. So to use the template, the first thing you may have to do is to actually register the Microsoft.Managed Services resource provider, because if it's a new subscription, then that resource provider is not registered automatically by default. And then you will then deploy a template that contains the registration definition and the registration assignment or assignments. So the definition will reference the MSP tenant ID and describe the permissions that you're going to grant to that MSP. It's not tied to any particular marketplace offer. It's just whatever details your MSP provides for you that you're going to put directly into that definition. The registration assignment then is then made at each of the scopes that you wish to assign. It simply references the definition, and you make multiple assignments, one for each scope that you're delegating, maybe for each subscription or for each of the resource groups that you're delegating. You'll make one of these assignments. Because it's a subscription level deployment, even if you're doing the assignment at resource group level, don't forget the definition is still a subscription level resource. Because this is a subscription level deployment, you will have to deploy this template using the command line tools, using PowerShell or CLI, for example. And all of this is done on the customer side. There's no action from the MSP required here. The only thing the MSP has to do is the partner has to do is to provide the GUIDs for the tenant ID and the object ID, such as the users or the groups that the permissions are being granted to. So the MSP provides those details to the customer, but all action, the actual deployment, is on the customer side. There are example templates available in a GitHub repository that the Azure Lighthouse team maintains, and you can see the link at the bottom of the slide. So in there, you'll find a couple of different template examples, one for delegating subscriptions and one for delegating resource groups. And you'll also find a bunch of other useful template examples. For example, if you want to use policy as a resource provider, there's some example templates for how to do that. So there's a lot of useful resources within that GitHub repository. Let's have a quick look at what the template might look like. Here we see an example of a template that can be used to delegate a subscription to a provider. And you see here the two resources we talked about. The first one is the Microsoft Managed Services registration definition. And this contains the definition name and description, the tenant ID of the service provider, and an array containing the authorizations, the permissions that are going to be granted, and the object IDs of the entities that will be given those permissions. And then we see the registration assignment. And in this case, it's at subscription scope. There's another example in the repository that we mentioned that provides the assignment at resource group scope. And you can see here, this depends on the registration definition being deployed first. That makes total sense. And the only property here is a link to the resource ID of the registration definition. So there's no additional settings as part of the registration assignment. But what is important is the scope at which this registration assignment is created. So those are the two resources that we're going to create. And if we look, obviously what's key here are the different parameters that are being passed in particular the authorizations and the tenant ID and so on. And if we look at the parameters file, if I'm switching to the parameters file here, you can see that the offer name is simply the Contoso Managed Services. This is the offer that the MSP is making to the customer. Here it's phrased in a way like a marketplace offering, but of course you could use this outside of a marketplace context. This also works in an enterprise scenario where you have an enterprise with more than one Azure AD tenant. Here we provide the tenant ID that is going to receive this delegation. And then the authorizations array contains the different entities that are going to get the permissions. In this case, there's a group called the Contoso security team with this object ID, and they're always the ones getting the permissions, all of the delegations to that same group. Although you could, of course, mix this up and have different groups granted different permissions. And then the last part here is the role that's being assigned. So to get these role definition IDs, you'd simply have to go into Azure PowerShell, for example, and do get AZ role definition, and it will you provide the role name, and it will spit out the details of that role, including the GUID that represents that particular role. And I've put comments here to say which role it is, because the one problem with these authorizations is they're not very human readable. So it's a good idea to put a little comment on to say, look, okay, that was the contributor role. This is the resource policy contributor. And this is the managed services role assignment delete role, that mouthful that we'll talk again about this. And here the user access administrator. And in this case, remember that with user access administrator, you have to specify which roles the user access administrator will be able to assign. They won't be able to assign just any role. And the roles that they will have the ability to assign are the ones you list here under this delegated role definition IDs. And in this case, that's the contributor role. Okay, great. So this is the template that you need to deploy. To deploy the template, you will deploy it from PowerShell, or from Azure CLI, and there's a command here to do so. Simply a new AZ deployment, and you provide the links to the file and the parameters file. And I won't deploy it here because I've deployed it already. We've seen how to use Azure Lighthouse, both using the marketplace approach and the template-based approach. Now, one thing that we need to spend a little bit of time looking at more closely are the permissions that you need, both on the partner side and on the customer side, to use Lighthouse, because this is an area that is very important to understand from a security point of view, and also something that is very easy to get tripped up by. So understanding the permissions is key to success with Lighthouse. First of all, from the managed service provider, if they're going to use the Azure Marketplace, they will need to enroll in the commercial marketplace program, and they will need the silver or gold cloud platform competency in order to be accepted into that program. With the appropriate marketplace permissions, then they will be able to publish their offer to the marketplace. When a customer accepts their offer from the marketplace, there are actually no actions required from the MSP. Once the marketplace offer is published, any customer can just accept that offer, assuming it was a public offer. Any customer can accept that offer, or if it was a private offer, any subscription that was listed in the private offer can accept that offer. And there's no action required for the MSP at that stage when the marketplace offer is consumed. And as a result, of course, there are no permissions required for the MSP. It's all on the customer side at that point. However, the MSP may wish to remove a customer from their delegated permissions. Maybe they have the relationship with the customer has ended, and they want to remove that delegation from the customer. And that's where this role, the managed services registration assignment delete role, is important. That role should really always be included in the permissions that the partner specifies in their manifest, in their marketplace offering, so that they will always have the permissions needed to remove a customer delegation. Now, this only lets them remove the assignment. It doesn't let them remove the definition, but it still means that they can remove their responsibility for that customer by removing those assignments, so that then they can't be held accountable for anything that happens in the subscription from that point onwards. Now, on the customer side, when they use the marketplace to accept one of these managed services offers, as we said, what's actually happening is that they're creating a Microsoft.managed services registration definitions resource. And this is included in the Azure owner built-in role, and is in fact actually tied to the owner role. You could create a custom role that allows you to create that resource type, but that won't enable you to create the relationship with the partner. It's actually hard-coded against the owner role itself. So you will need to be a subscription owner in order to create that relationship with the partner. And likewise, for the second stage, where the customer is delegating a subscription or resource group to the partner they have the relationship with. Again, this is the Microsoft.managed services WAC registration assignments resource, and it is tied to the owner role. Custom roles are not going to work there. So once the relationship between the customer and the partner has been established, as part of